Hey guys, tonight we are going to embark on a spine-chilling journey where a royal spirit still lingers within the cold, stone walls of the Tower of London. This isn't just a history story. This is a grievous, unjust sentence written in blood and lies. Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII, is a name that evokes charisma, ambition, and the most horrifying end. She wasn't just a queen who was beheaded. She was a spiritual victim, pushed into a deadly trap by the very husband she loved and trusted most. What turned a woman destined for coronation into a prisoner? Was it a curse for breaking up a royal marriage? Or simply the sheer cruelty of men intent on erasing her from history? Today, we won't just talk about the French executioner's final blow. We're going to uncover the buried secrets beneath the chapel floor, where her remains were discovered centuries later. It was Dr. Frederick Moir, the royal physician, who personally conducted the exhumation and post-mortem examination, who discovered many shattering details about Anne's death and identity. He found scientific evidence that no one expected, proving an almost unbelievable fact about her little neck. But what exactly were those findings, and how shattering are they? Stay tuned in the video for the specifics. The real cause of Anne's death wasn't the sword, but the vicious lies co-conspired by the court, simply to clear the way for Jane Seymour. Do you believe in the revenge of a spirit? Prepare yourselves to listen to the story of the betrayed woman whose death changed the destiny of England forever. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm curious. Tell me where you are and what the local time is as you listen to this story. Is it raining, or are you immersed in the deep stillness of the night? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Queen Anne Boleyn was the second wife of King Henry VIII, and she is remembered most poignantly for her tragic end. She was executed and lost her head within the walls of the Tower of London. Ironically, the very place where she had once waited in anxious anticipation for her coronation as queen would become her final prison. Anne fell victim to an elaborate plot orchestrated by King Henry himself, with the backing of his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell. She was formally charged with treason, adultery, and incest charges that were later proven to be utterly false. The official cause of her death was decapitation by sword, carried out by a French executioner whose blade came down upon her neck on the morning of May 19, 1536. Yet the deeper cause was far more insidious. The web of lies woven by powerful men at court who wished to remove Anne so that the king might marry his third wife, Jane Seymour. Anne's story begins with her rise to prominence in the English court, first as a maid of honour, and then as the woman who captivated the king's heart after his marriage to Catherine of Aragon failed to produce a male heir. By the spring of 1536, she had borne him one daughter, Princess Elizabeth, but her inability to deliver a son weighed heavily on the king's mind and on the politics of succession. Behind closed doors, Henry's frustration grew, and Cromwell seized upon the moment to engineer Anne's downfall. False witnesses came forward, claiming to have seen her in compromising situations, and scandalous rumours spread like wildfire through the corridors of power. Anne's enemies at court, some of whom had long resented her influence, found in Cromwell's machinations the perfect opportunity to settle old scores. On the morning of her execution, Anne was said to have spoken with remarkable composure. According to William Kingston, the constable of the Tower of London, she summoned him so that she might receive the sacrament and affirm her innocence one last time. She jested lightly about the slenderness of her neck, and expressed amusement that the executioner, though skilled, must take extra care. With her ladies-in-waiting surrounding her, she made her way to the scaffold erected on the north side of the White Tower. There, in front of hundreds of onlookers who had sneaked past locked doors or watched through narrow windows, Anne climbed the steps, her dark gown brushing the wooden planks, and addressed the crowd in a calm, measured voice. "Good Christian people," she declared, "I am come hither to die, for according to the law and by the law I am condemned to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you." After a brief prayer, she knelt, and the executioner's assistant tied a blindfold over her eyes. Anne murmured her final invocation, "O Lord, have mercy on me. O Lord, receive my soul." Then the French swordsman stepped forward, drew his two-handed sword from behind a bale of straw, and with a single, swift stroke, severed her head. The crowd gasped in horror as her body slumped, and a hush fell over the tower. Centuries later, during extensive restorations of St. Peter ad Vincula Chapel, workers uncovered a grave beneath the chapel floor, containing a decapitated female skeleton. In the 19th century, a royal physician, Dr. Frederick Maundy, conducted a post-mortem examination and identified the remains as those of a woman in the prime of life, around 25 to 30 years old, of delicate frame and slender neck details that matched contemporary descriptions of Anne. His findings confirmed what history books had recorded. Anne Boleyn's life was cut short by a conspiracy of lies, and her death by the sword was but the final act in a drama of power, deception, and ambition at the Tudor court. Anne Boleyn was undeniably one of the most controversial figures during her brief tenure as Queen of England. From the moment she stepped into the royal court, she inspired both fascination and resentment. Across the realm, many women openly despised her, viewing her as the home-wrecker who had shattered the long and solemn marriage of King Henry VIII to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. To obtain a divorce from Catherine, so that he might marry Anne, the king went to extraordinary lengths, culminating in his self-declaration as supreme head of the Church of England on the 23rd day of November in the year 1534. This seismic act of religious rebellion severed ties with the Bishop of Rome and set in motion the dissolution of the monasteries, whereby hundreds of religious houses were closed and their wealth absorbed into the royal treasury. Despite these earth-shaking changes, Anne's own ability to secure her position by providing a male heir proved tragically insufficient. In the summer of 1533, on the 7th day of September, she gave birth to Princess Elizabeth, who would one day become England's most celebrated Tudor monarch, Elizabeth I. Yet the king's desire for a son remained unsatisfied. In the early months of 1534, Anne suffered a miscarriage. A similar loss occurred in the autumn of 1535. Each time, the court whispered that the Queen's body was inadequate for the production of a male heir. This failure became the single greatest cause of her undoing. King Henry's hope for dynastic stability lay with a healthy son who could secure the Tudor succession. Anne's inability to deliver such an heir was perceived as both a personal and political failing. As her pregnancies ended in sorrow, the king's attentions drifted elsewhere. Among those who filled her place at court was Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting. Jane was reputed to be gentle, compliant, and, most importantly in the eyes of the monarch, capable of bearing him a son. By the spring of 1536, Henry's impatience had reached its zenith. He had grown weary of the turmoil that surrounded Anne, the endless controversies, the bitter factionalism among courtiers, and the persistent rumours of impropriety. Jane, in contrast, seemed a model of quiet devotion, and her promise of a male child enticed the king's hope anew. Thus, the very court that had once celebrated Anne's elevation to queen now conspired to see her removed. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's cunning chief minister, seized upon the opportunity created by Anne's misfortunes. He quietly marshalled false witness accounts and dubious testimony to accuse her of treason, adultery, and even incest charges that would shock the nation when they became public in the spring of 1536. Behind the polished veneer of Tudor pageantry, a darker drama unfolded. A queen, vilified and betrayed, watched helplessly as her husband and his ministers plotted her fall. In the hush that followed each royal miscarriage, Anne must have felt the walls of power closing in around her. Once a favoured maid of honour, and then a woman of unbounded promise, she found herself isolated at the nexus of religious upheaval, dynastic anxiety, and courtly intrigue. And as the seeds of suspicion took root, her fate was sealed. Stripped of allies, maligned by scandal, and abandoned by the man she had loved, Anne Boleyn stood on the brink of an end more chilling than any of the political storms she had weathered. To remove Anne from his path, King Henry VIII entrusted his chief minister Thomas Cromwell with the grim task of fabricating a series of false charges and forging evidence against the Queen. At that time, no noblewoman of her rank had ever faced execution, making the king's decision to proceed all the more shocking for the realm. Anne, though she had many enemies at court, women who despised her as the home-wrecker who had supplanted Catherine of Aragon, could never have imagined that her own husband would turn his hand against her and order her death. Cromwell moved swiftly and silently. He recruited dubious witnesses to claim they had seen Anne in compromising situations with various court gentlemen. He arranged for secret interrogations, ensuring that testimony seemed to emerge organically. Among those ensnared in the plot were 5 men, each accused of adultery with the Queen. One was her own brother, George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, a charge that would have struck terror even into the heart of a royal family. These 5 men were brought before a special court at Westminster in early May of 1536. Their trials were a mere formality, for Cromwell had already predetermined the outcome. Within days, they were found guilty and sentenced to die by the axe on Tower Hill. One particularly tragic figure was a court musician whose art had once soothed Anne's spirits. Under torture, he confessed to a crime he did not commit, desperately hoping to end his agony even as he betrayed his queen. On the 15th day of May, in the year 1536, Anne Boleyn, still imprisoned within the Tower of London, was formally indicted on the same charges: treason, adultery, and incest. By this point, her fate was sealed. The executions of her alleged accomplices had demonstrated the Crown's resolve, and the Council of Peers that judged her sat under Cromwell's watchful eye. No plea of innocence could sway them, for the machinery of state had already ground her down. That morning a hushed procession led Anne from her private apartments to the scaffold erected near the north side of the White Tower. 4 women who had once attended her every need now guided her trembling steps. Ahead of her, the executioner's block stood ready, and the axe that had beheaded her accusers gleamed in the spring sunlight. The Queen, draped in a dark gown and with her black hair bound beneath a linen coif, faced her end with the eerie calm that had both enthralled and enraged the court. Though Anne spoke no words of protest, her mere presence on that scaffold spoke volumes. It was a tableau of betrayal. A queen, undone by lies. A king, undone by ambition. And a minister, Thomas Cromwell, who had mastered the cruel art of political murder. In that bleak moment, the dynasty's future seemed less certain than ever, for the very laws meant to secure the Tudor lineage had been twisted into instruments of injustice. And so, with her life extinguished, Anne Boleyn became the first English queen consort to taste the axe, and the last, until laws and loyalties changed centuries later. Thomas Cromwell exercised his influence with chilling precision, manipulating every juror and witness involved in Queen Anne's trial to ensure her conviction. Though Anne was formally condemned in Westminster Hall, she could scarcely believe that execution awaited her so near to the king's private chambers, where she had once dined and danced, felt impossibly distant now. The notion that King Henry VIII would order the death of his own wife must have seemed inconceivable. Yet the falsified case that Cromwell had assembled left no avenue of appeal. Cromwell, a former lawyer turned chief minister, had marshalled an array of forged documents and coerced testimonies to paint Anne as a traitor to both crown and country. Spurious letters were produced to suggest illicit correspondence. Unreliable attendants were coached to swear they had witnessed her in compromising acts. Even the charge of incest, most grotesque of all, rested on the forced confession of her own brother, George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford. Under the threat of torture, he admitted to an impossibility, providing Cromwell with the sensational scandal needed to destroy his sister's reputation. By the 9th day of May, in the year 1536, the verdict was a foregone conclusion. Anne was summoned from her cell in the Tower of London to the Royal Council Chamber, where she stood in regal poise despite the shadow of death looming over her. "Madam," Cromwell is said to have declared, "the law has spoken." She offered no protest, knowing that every outcry could only hasten her doom. In that moment, the weight of statecraft pressed upon her slender shoulders, and the court's murmurings carried the certainty of finality. On the morning of May 15th, Queen Anne ascended the scaffold laid by the north wall of the White Tower. She wore a modest black gown, her hair bound beneath a white linen coif. The executioner's block stood ready, a silent testament to Cromwell's triumph over his most prized client. Before the axe fell, Anne delivered her last words with serene dignity. She professed no hatred, blamed no man, and prayed for the king's long life, an act of grace that belied the savagery beneath. In the silent aftermath, as her body crumpled and the Crown's men retrieved her remains, the political ripples spread outward. Anne Boleyn became, in the eyes of posterity, a victim and innocent, caught in a web of power plays and dynastic designs. She had been sacrificed not for any crime she committed, but for the king's boundless desire for a male heir and for Cromwell's ruthless consolidation of royal authority. This episode marks one of the darkest stains on the Tudor dynasty, the execution of a queen on the pretense of justice, when in truth it was nothing more than a meticulously staged political tragedy. Henry's willingness to destroy the life and legacy of his second wife stands as a stark reminder of his absolute sovereignty and of its capacity for cruelty. Anne Boleyn did not die by the sword alone. She fell at the hands of ambition and deceit, leaving behind a legacy of injustice that echoes through history. On the 19th day of May, in the year 1536, within the ancient walls of the Tower of London, William Kingston, the Constable of the Tower, recorded Queen Anne's final words with solemn care. Early that morning, Anne sent for Kingston so that she might receive the Holy Eucharist and speak of her absolute innocence one last time. As he later recounted, she appeared remarkably serene, even joyful, as if preparing for a sacred journey rather than a grim execution. "I have heard," she told him, "that the executioner is very skillful, and I have a little neck only." With a light laugh, she placed her hands about her throat, as though to demonstrate her slenderness, and Kingston observed that never before had he seen a condemned person meet death with such evident delight. Before dawn broke fully on that spring morning, Anne and Kingston attended Mass together in her private apartments. The Queen knelt at the altar rail, her head bowed in prayer, affirming that she had never been unfaithful to the king. As the sacrament was administered, the hush of the chapel seemed to cradle her in calm assurance. When the rite concluded, she rose and turned to Kingston, accepting his hand in quiet gratitude. He drew from his pocket a prayer book, which she kissed with reverence, and then she asked him to remain by her side for what was to come. Kingston described how Anne listened to the words of the priest with unwavering faith, her lips moving softly, even as the faint candlelight danced upon the stone walls. She spoke little, but each word carried the weight of conviction. "Let us go," she said at last, "for I shall soon be with my lord." When told that the executioner was ready, she nodded with composure and prepared herself mentally for the journey ahead. Dressed in a modest dark gown, Anne allowed her 4 ladies-in-waiting, her loyal attendants, to accompany her. Together they formed a small procession that moved through the corridors of the royal apartments. Kingston led the way, his heavy boots echoing on the flagstones, while the Queen's soft steps followed in measured rhythm. There was no clamour, no shouting, only the quiet tread of those who marched toward fate. The scaffold had been erected on the north side of the White Tower, in the area now known as the Waterloo Barracks, where the crown jewels are kept under lock and key. The morning sun, still low in the sky, cast long shadows across the yard. Anne paused at the foot of the steps, glanced back toward the royal chamber she had once occupied so proudly, and then ascended with a graceful calm. Her ladies placed a simple linen coif over her hair, and Kingston watched as she knelt before the block. In that silent moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Anne closed her eyes briefly, as if in final prayer, then lifted her chin, exposing the thin white line of her neck. She uttered no lament, spoke no accusation. Instead, she whispered, "O Lord, have mercy on me. O Lord, receive my soul." The solemn hush was broken only by the distant tolling of a chapel bell. As the executioner prepared his blade, Kingston stood by, tears glistening in his eyes. He thought of the Queen's gentle courage and the irony that the woman who had once walked the opulent halls of Westminster now faced death with such unwavering serenity. In those final moments, Anne Boleyn embodied a tragic blend of innocence and dignity, her spirit unbroken even as the axe fell. Although Anne Boleyn stood on the very brink of death, she displayed a remarkably positive demeanour as she ascended the scaffold that still bore the fresh scent of straw. On that pale morning of May 19th, 1536, she moved forward with a confidence that belied her fate, her dark gown sweeping gently over the wooden planks. Hundreds of spectators, some having slipped through doors that had been left ajar by sympathetic guards, crowded the enclosure around the north side of the White Tower. Through narrow windows and over low walls, commoners and courtiers alike strained for a glimpse of the fallen queen. Once upon the raised platform, Anne paused and turned to face the sea of faces. The early sunlight filtered through the tower's austere battlements, illuminating her features with a soft, forgiving glow. For a moment, the hush of anticipation gave way to the quiet whisper of prayer. Then, with measured grace, she addressed the crowd in a clear, calm voice, each word chosen to preserve both her own dignity and the honor of her young daughter, Princess Elizabeth. "Good Christian people," Anne began, her tone both sincere and controlled. "I am come hither to die, and according to the law and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that whereof I am accused and condemned to die." These carefully crafted words avoided any direct challenge to King Henry's authority. Anne understood that an outright denial might provoke the wrath of her husband and imperil the future of her daughter. Instead, she chose to invoke the compassion of God, appealing to the crowd's faith rather than indulging in political recrimination. The speech was an act of last resort, a conscious effort to shield Elizabeth from the stain of scandal and to reaffirm the Queen's unwavering loyalty to both her sovereign and her faith. As she spoke, Anne's gaze swept over the assemblage. She saw faces etched with sorrow and fascination, eyes glistening with tears, or alight with grim curiosity. Yet she showed no tremor of fear. Her posture remained erect, her voice steady. In that moment she embodied both the fallen queen and the steadfast mother, her speech serving as a bridge between her own tragic end and her daughter's uncertain future. After her final words, Anne inclined her head in a graceful bow and knelt before the block. A lady-in-waiting adjusted the simple linen coif at her nape, and the executioner's assistant fastened the blindfold over her eyes. Even then, Anne offered no further protest. She lifted her chin for a brief instant, perhaps to whisper a final prayer before the blade fell. In an instant, the speech that had resonated so hauntingly across the courtyard was silenced, and the crowd stood in solemn reverence at the passing of a queen who had met her end with unwavering poise. Thus ended Anne Boleyn's public testament, a speech both wise and cautious, delivered with the purpose of protecting her daughter's honour and preserving her own dignity in the face of unspeakable betrayal. In her final address, Anne Boleyn bowed her head ever so slightly, offering one last gesture of respect or perhaps a reluctant acceptance toward the husband who had turned against her. With a soft, even voice that carried across the hushed courtyard, she uttered words that must have startled her listeners with their grace. "But I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you. He hath ever been a good, a gentle, and a sovereign lord." In that moment, Anne fulfilled the solemn duties of a royal wife, ensuring that Henry VIII could harbour no doubt of her loyalty even as she faced the axe. Her choice of words was both strategic and poignant. By invoking divine favour upon the king, "I pray God save the king," Anne acknowledged his authority, weaving her final act of obedience into a prayer. She lauded his virtues, kindness, gentleness, sovereignty. Whether her praise was heartfelt or compelled by circumstance is a question lost to history. Yet her tone lay somewhere between genuine respect and a form of defiance. For if the king was indeed good, gentle, and sovereign, as she proclaimed, then her own execution could only underscore the tragic excesses of his power. After extolling Henry's merits, Anne paused. The morning light filtered through the tower's grey walls, casting soft shadows across her face. She remained composed, her gaze fixed beyond the heads of the gathered crowd. Then, in a voice that faltered with emotion yet did not break, she delivered her farewell. "I come hither to die, and I accuse no man, nor speak anything of that whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray you all, good Christian people, to pray for me. I commend my spirit unto the hands of God." These words, echoing with both dignity and vulnerability, brought many grown men to tears. Witnesses later recounted how weathered knights and hardened guards fought back sobs as they heard her speak. In those lines, Anne thanked her ladies-in-waiting, her 4 faithful companions who had tended her through illness and imprisonment. She expressed gratitude for their dutiful service, acknowledging the small comforts they had provided in her final days. This act of appreciation further humanized the fallen queen, transforming her from a figure of scandal into a woman beloved by those closest to her. As she finished, Anne lifted her eyes to heaven, lips moving in silent prayer. The crowd fell utterly silent, as though compelled to honour the earnestness of her final entreaty. No man dared clamour for vengeance or murmur in dissent. Instead, a hush of reverence settled over the yard. Even the executioner's assistant stood motionless, the axe poised in waiting. In that poignant tableau, Anne Boleyn, kneeling at the block, reciting her last prayer, expressing loyalty to the king, and bidding farewell to the world, she transcended the scandal that had enveloped her life. Her final gesture of respect toward Henry VIII, coupled with her emotional farewell to her attendants and her appeal for prayers, ensured that her last legacy would be one of grace and piety. And as the blade descended, the echo of her words lingered in the dawn air, a testament to a queen who met her end with unwavering composure and a heart laid bare before God and man alike. After her final words drifted into the morning air, it was time for the grim necessity to be carried out. The executioner, a French swordsman of noted skill, was presented with a small purse of gold payment for performing his duty both swiftly and with precision. This purse, brimming with coins, functioned almost like a bribe, ensuring that there would be no hesitation or error when the blade met Anne's neck. It was whispered among onlookers that the king himself had authorized this extra payment, hoping to grant Anne the mercy of a single, instantaneous stroke, rather than a botched or prolonged ordeal. One of Anne's 4 ladies-in-waiting stepped forward to carry out the final, tender task of blindfolding the queen. She drew a length of fine linen across Anne's eyes, muffling the world until only the soft rustle of silk remained. Anne knelt at the block, her hands steady upon the wood as she prepared her soul for its final passage. With a hush that fell over the 100 or more witnesses, peasants, guards, and courtiers alike, she whispered her last prayer. "O Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." Behind a modest bale of straw placed near the block, the executioner stood ready, his 2-handed sword concealed from Anne's view. His assistant, eager to facilitate the clean stroke for which the gold had been offered, clanked a small metal pan against the barricade. The sudden sound drew Anne's attention to the right, causing her head to turn ever so slightly. In that instant, from the left, the executioner brought the blade down in a single smooth motion. The report of steel on flesh was as sharp as a whisper in the still morning. Anne's head fell away without hesitation, and in the space of but a few heartbeats, her life ebbed from her neck. The blade had done precisely as promised. No slip, no nick, just a clean severance. A pale droplet of blood blossomed upon the worn wood of the scaffold before draining into the straw below. In those few seconds, the drama of a queen's rise and fall was sealed in silent testament. As the head tumbled into the executioner's waiting hand, a solemn calm reasserted itself over the courtyard. The onlookers, uncertain whether to speak or weep, remained rooted in place. Some could not hold back tears, others looked away, unable to witness more. Even the executioner's assistant stood motionless, his task complete. Moments later, the executioner lifted Anne's severed head by her dark hair and showed it to the crowd, as was custom, before placing both head and body into a prepared coffin. The ladies-in-waiting gathered the black gown and linen coif, wrapping them gently around their queen's remains in a final act of devotion. In the hush that followed, the reality of what had transpired settled like a shadow over the Tower of London. After the sword fell, severing her head from her body, Anne Boleyn's life ended in a mere instant, yet, as eyewitnesses noted, her heart is said to have beaten 1 or 2 more times before stilling forever. In that brief flicker of vitality, blood from her severed arteries spattered across the wooden block, pooling on the straw and staining the boards of the scaffold. The entire execution, from the draw of the blade to the final drop of crimson, was staggeringly swift. A single, decisive act that left the gathered crowd in stunned silence. For centuries, the details of Anne's final moments passed into the murky realm of legend and conjecture. Her death became a cautionary tale, whispered in Tudor corridors and later immortalized in chronicles and plays. Yet the corporeal proof of her fate lay hidden beneath the very chapel where her body was laid to rest. St. Peter ad Vincula, the modest parish church within the Tower of London's walls. It was not until the Victorian era, during the extensive restorations carried out in 1855 under the reign of Queen Victoria, that workers inadvertently uncovered a set of human remains beneath the chapel's cold stone floor. At that time, Queen Victoria, who ascended the throne on the 20th day of June in the year 1837, presided over an empire gripped by fascination with its own past. The rediscovery of a decapitated skeleton, interred in a shallow grave beneath the chancel, electrified antiquarians and antiquaries alike. The bones lay in disarray, wrapped only in fragments of cloth that bore the wear of nearly 3 centuries underground. Yet even in that disordered state, the key features remained discernible. A slender neck, the sturdy vertebrae of a woman in her prime, and skull fragments that suggested a clean, surgical severance. This chance excavation opened the door to a new chapter in Tudor history. Scholars and physicians were invited to study the remains, seeking to verify the stories preserved in dusty tomes. Over the following decades, careful examination confirmed that the bones belonged to a female of approximately 25 to 30 years of age, with a height estimated between 5 feet and 5 feet 3 inches. The condition of the cervical vertebrae, particularly the first vertebra beneath the skull, bore the unmistakable mark of decapitation. As Queen Victoria's reign progressed, these findings were published in learned journals, capturing the public imagination and cementing Anne Boleyn's posthumous reputation as a tragic victim of political intrigue. The discovery beneath St. Peter ad Vincula thus bridged the gap between myth and material evidence. It transformed Anne from a figure of scandal into a woman whose physical remains could testify to the injustice she suffered. In the hushed confines of the restored chapel, visitors could now contemplate not only the words of chroniclers, but also the silent testimony of bone and stone. And so, the final act in Anne Boleyn's story, once lost to time, re-emerged in the age of Queen Victoria, granting posterity both confirmation and closure for one of history's most infamous executions. In the mid-19th century, following the unexpected discovery of the skeletal remains beneath St. Peter ad Vincula in the year 1855, the Crown appointed a royal physician, Dr. St. Frederick Moir, to conduct a thorough post-mortem investigation. Working in the quiet, candlelit confines of a makeshift mortuary within the tower, Dr. Moir meticulously recorded his findings, intent on matching the physical evidence to the historical record of Anne Boleyn. Dr. Moir noted first the age estimate. The bones belonged to a female in the range of 25 to 30 years, precisely the age Anne would have been at her death in 1536. He measured the long bones of the arms and legs, finding their lengths consistent with an adult woman of average Tudor stature. His measurements suggested a height of approximately 5 feet 1 inch to 5 feet 3 inches, aligning with contemporary descriptions of Anne's slender build. Turning to the skull, Dr. Mouat observed a well-formed, rounded cranial vault and a high, broad forehead features often noted in portraits of the Queen. The lower jaw, or mandible, was small yet perfectly proportioned, creating an oval facial outline that matched the refined elegance attributed to Anne in courtly accounts. No signs of trauma or disease marred these bones. Rather, they spoke of a woman in the vigorous prime of life. Perhaps the most telling evidence lay in the vertebrae. Dr. Mouat drew particular attention to the cervical column, especially the first cervical vertebra, known as the atlas. This bone, which supports the skull, was remarkably diminutive. Its small size corroborated Anne's own remark, recorded by William Kingston, that she possessed a little neck, a detail she herself had humorously highlighted on the morning of her execution. The atlas's dimensions, when compared to later vertebrae, provided incontrovertible proof of a slender, delicate neck consistent with the Queen's final jest. Dr. Mouat also catalogued the condition of the ribs, noting a graceful curvature and sufficient depth to suggest robust respiratory capacity. The hands and feet bones displayed tapering phalanges and narrow metacarpals and metatarsals, indicating delicate, well-shaped extremities, a characteristic often associated with noble women of her station. All elements combined to paint a portrait of Anne in bone, a woman of lithe elegance, symmetrical form, and youthful health. Throughout his examination, Dr. Mouat carefully compared each anatomical detail to extant letters, ambassadorial reports, and eyewitness accounts from the Tudor court. He cross-referenced measurements and physical descriptions, ensuring that his conclusions rested on both empirical data and documented history. His final report, published in a scholarly journal of 1857, concluded that there was no reasonable doubt the remains were indeed those of Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII. By matching skeletal evidence to the Queen's age, stature, and unique anatomical traits, Dr. Frederick Mouat's Postmortem provided a remarkable confirmation of a centuries-old narrative. In doing so, he transformed legend into forensic fact, allowing Anne Boleyn, once silenced by the sword, to speak anew through the language of bone and science. Dr. Frederick Muir's Postmortem investigation, undertaken in the year 1855 and published in 1857, concluded with a confident affirmation. The skeletal remains belonged to a single female individual in the prime of life, wholly consistent and symmetrical in their formation. His detailed anatomical description not only confirmed the identity of the bones as those of Queen Anne Boleyn, but also substantiated many of the physical characteristics attributed to her in contemporary accounts. Beginning with the skull, Dr. Muir observed a well-rounded cranial vault, smoothly contoured and without deformity. The forehead, described historically as intellectual, rose gracefully, suggesting both physiological strength and aristocratic bearing. The brow ridges, or orbital ridges, were straight rather than pronounced, framing large eye sockets that would have housed conspicuous eyes. Such anatomy aligned with descriptions of Anne's penetrating gaze and expressive countenance. Muir's examination of the mandible revealed a lower jaw that was small yet robust, culminating in a square chin that lent the face an overall oval shape. This combination of features, rounded skull, broad forehead, straight orbital ridges, large orbits, oval face, and square chin painted a portrait in bone that echoed the Queen's reputed elegance and intelligence. Turning to the vertebral column, Dr. Muir noted that the cervical vertebrae were diminutive, particularly the atlas, the first cervical vertebra immediately beneath the skull. Its slender dimensions provided anatomical proof of the little neck that Anne herself had mentioned with wry humour before her execution on the 19th day of May in the year 1536. The subsequent 7 cervical vertebrae maintained this delicate tapering, supporting the head with a grace that suited royal portraiture. The ribs offered further testimony to the Queen's physique. Deep and rounded, they suggested a chest cavity capable of strong, measured breathing, perhaps a reflection of the spirited woman known for her composure and presence of mind. The curvature and uniform spacing of the ribs indicated healthy development, free from signs of illness or malnutrition. In his cataloguing of the long bones, Dr. Muir measured the humeri, radii, ulnae, femora, tibiae, and fibulae, finding that they corresponded to an adult woman of average Tudor height, approximately 5 feet 1 inch to 5 feet 3 inches. The proportions of these bones demonstrated symmetry and strength, with muscle attachment sites that hinted at a lifestyle not solely sedentary, but involving the poised bearing and measured movement expected of a queen. Finally, the bones of the hands and feet completed the portrait. The metacarpals and metatarsals were narrow yet sturdy, the phalanges tapering to slender, elegant digits. Such fine, well-proportioned extremities corroborated descriptions of Anne's delicate hands, so often depicted in paintings holding a prayer book or gently resting upon her daughter's cradle. Dr. Muir's meticulous notes provided a three-dimensional glimpse into Anne Boleyn's physical form, transforming whispered legends into a tangible anatomical record. His findings validated the oral traditions that spoke of her graceful neck, intelligent brow, commanding eyes, and noble stature. In the quiet hush of the tower's restored chapel, the bones of Queen Anne emerged not merely as relics of a bygone era, but as enduring proof of a life marked by poise, purpose, and tragic consequence. Based on his careful measurements, Dr. Frederick Muir estimated that the woman whose bones lay entombed beneath St. Peter ad Vincula stood approximately 5 feet to 5 feet 3 inches in life, roughly 1.52 meters to 1.60 meters. This height falls squarely within the typical range for Tudor women of noble birth, for whom diet and status often ensured adequate growth. More compelling, however, was Dr. Muir's confirmation that the skull had been cleanly severed from the body. In his report, he described the cervical vertebrae bearing the unmistakable mark of decapitation, the smooth, even cut-through bone that only a skilled executioner's blade could produce. This singular piece of evidence narrowed the field of possible identities considerably. In the annals of the Tower of London and its surrounding grounds, only a handful of aristocratic women had met such a fate. Among them were Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, who was executed on Tower Green on the 27th day of May in the year 1538. Catherine Howard, the 5th wife of King Henry VIII, beheaded on the 13th day of February in the year 1539. And Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, whose life ended on Tower Green on the 12th day of February in the year 1549. Each of these women left behind its own tragic legacy, yet none met quite the confluence of physical clues that Dr. Moat observed in this particular set of remains. The process of elimination was as much historical as it was anatomical. Dr. Moat cross-referenced his forensic findings with contemporary chronicles, execution records, and ambassadorial dispatches. Margaret Pole, at the age of 67, would have had bones showing signs of advanced age arthritic changes in the joints and a less robust bone density. Catherine Howard, no more than 20 years old at her death, would have presented a slightly more juvenile skeletal profile, with growth plates perhaps less fully fused. Lady Jane Grey, about 16 or 17 at her execution, would likewise lack some of the bone maturity Dr. Moat documented. Only one noblewoman remained whose age at death, physique and circumstances of execution matched all the evidence. Anne Boleyn, approximately 29 years old, when she died on the 19th day of May in the year 1536. Thus, the postmortem transcended mere scientific inquiry. It became a rigorous exercise in historical deduction. By combining empirical measurements with meticulously recorded Tudor-era data, Dr. Moat effectively bridged centuries, connecting an anonymous skeleton to one of the most famous queens in English history. The confirmation that the skull and body belonged to a single individual, the correct age, proper height, and the clear hallmark of decapitation on those first cervical vertebrae, all pointed unequivocally to Anne Boleyn. In the quiet sanctum of St. Peter ad Vincula, where the bones had rested undisturbed for over 300 years, science had at last given voice to a long silent narrative. The anonymous remains became, through the lens of Dr. Moat's postmortem, a tangible link to the drama of Tudor politics, the cruelty of king-made law, and the enduring memory of the Queen whose life was cut short by ambition and betrayal. After carefully comparing every detail of his anatomical findings with the weight of centuries-old chronicles, Dr. Frederick Moat arrived at his definitive conclusion. He placed particular emphasis on the diminutive nature of the cervical column, especially the first cervical vertebra, known as the atlas, which bore the unmistakable hallmark of a little neck, just as Anne Boleyn herself had jested on the morning of her execution. This trait, recorded in the writings of William Kingston and other contemporaries, was no mere anecdote but a quantifiable anatomical feature. Dr. Moat was thus able to confirm, without a shred of doubt, that the remains he had so meticulously examined belonged to Anne Boleyn, the ill-fated second wife of King Henry VIII. This affirmation represented more than a triumph of medical sleuthing. It forged a tangible link between a long silent burial and the living history of Tudor England. In Dr. Moat's lab notes, he described how the atlas measured significantly smaller in breadth than the adjoining vertebrae, creating a slender, elegant column perfectly in accord with descriptions of the Queen's graceful posture. Coupled with the rounded cranium, intelligent forehead, straight orbital ridges, and well-formed mandible, these features blended into a consistent portrait that matched every surviving description of Anne's visage. By anchoring oral tradition to tangible bone, Dr. Moat delivered a profound service to both science and history. His investigation provided a measure of peace for the once restless spirit of a queen who had lain in that unassuming grave for 3 full centuries. No longer were the rumours and legends the only means by which Anne's story could surface. Now, her physical remains testified to her identity with forensic certainty. Scholars and laypeople alike could gaze upon his published illustrations and measurements, and know that the woman they had long read about was, at last, recognized by the very fabric of her being. Equally significant was the post-mortem confirmation of the cause of death, decapitation by a weapon of exceptional sharpness. The clean, unblemished cut across the cervical vertebrae indicated the work of a master swordsman in this case, a French executioner whose blade was said to have been exquisitely honed. Dr. Moat noted that the cut traversed the bone in a smooth, uninterrupted line, evidence that the execution had been performed swiftly and without hesitation. This forensic detail aligned precisely with contemporary accounts, emphasizing the executioner's skill and the king's desire for a single, decisive stroke. Over the centuries, storytellers had alternately magnified and softened the horrors of that fateful morning. Some described the scene as a grotesque spectacle, while others insisted the blow was clean and almost merciful. Dr. Muad's findings settled the debate. The method of execution, though undeniably brutal in its intent, was carried out with a professional efficiency that minimized suffering. His meticulous report thus lent credence to the gentler accounts, undercutting exaggerated tales of bungled attempts or prolonged agony. In synthesizing anatomical precision with historical testimony, Dr. Muad's Postmortem became both a forensic case study and a piece of historical exhumation. It illuminated the reality behind the rumor, the flesh behind the legend, providing a foundation upon which future generations of historians could build. The confirmation that Anne's remains had been both decapitated and precisely measured the right age, the right stature, the right anatomical idiosyncrasies, eliminated any remaining uncertainty. No other noblewoman who met her end on Tower Hill or within the tower's walls possessed that unique combination of skeletal characteristics. Thus, in the hushed stillness of the restored chapel at St. Peter ad Vincula, where the bones had rested for generations, science at last gave voice to an identity long obscured by time. Dr. Muad's decisive pronouncement, anchored in the small atlas, the perfect symmetry of bone, and the clean intersection of blade and vertebra, ensured that Anne Boleyn would be remembered not merely as a footnote in Tudor intrigue, but as a woman whose very remains bore witness to her life, her death, and the indelible mark she left on English history. As the archaeological revelations and forensic findings brought flesh to Anne Boleyn's bones, the currents of history continued to flow. Her death was not merely the close of a personal tragedy, but the catalyst for profound shifts in the crown, the royal family, and the fabric of English society. In the wake of May 19, 1536, we will trace the changing temperament of King Henry, the fate of Tudor offspring, the turbulent religious and political landscape, the surviving relics that whisper from the past, and, ultimately, the enduring lessons on power and justice that history has inscribed. King Henry VIII emerged from the shadow of Anne Boleyn's execution, a changed man, though the speed of his transition to a new marriage seemed to startle even the most seasoned courtiers. In the days immediately following the 19th of May in the year 1536, the king was said to move through Whitehall with an air of subdued relief, though his eyes betrayed a mixture of regret and resolve. Politically, he showed no hesitation in consolidating power. Thomas Cromwell continued to rise, implementing further reforms of the church and the royal administration, while Henry leaned on his Privy Council to secure the succession that Anne had ultimately failed to guarantee. Within a mere 24 hours of Anne's death, on the 20th day of May in 1536, Henry sent for Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting, and requested her hand in marriage. The announcement took London by surprise, yet it revealed the king's desperate urgency for a male heir. Despite the whirlwind circumstances, Jane consented without public hesitation. A formal betrothal followed on the 21st of May, with ambassadors from France and the Empire sending congratulatory dispatches, signs that European courts recognized the political necessity of stabilizing the Tudor lineage. By the 30th day of May in the same year, scarcely 11 days after Anne's final breath, Henry and Jane stood before the altar at Whitehall Palace in a solemn yet understated ceremony. The marriage was conducted in private to avoid the scandal of such rapid remarriage, but word spread swiftly. Jane, dressed in simple white linen, accepted the crown's weight with demure grace. Courtiers watched with a blend of admiration for the new queen's composure and unease at the king's seemingly capricious shift of affection. In the weeks that followed, Henry's mood took on a more studious cast. He withdrew from the lavish entertainments he had enjoyed with Anne, and instead devoted himself to the governance of the realm. His ministers noted that he worked late into many nights, reviewing correspondence, mediating disputes among the nobility, and issuing new proclamations. Most notably, he moved to complete the dissolution of the monasteries, a process Anne had supported, but which now accelerated under Jane's more cautious guidance. Revenues from closed abbeys poured into the royal coffers, allowing Henry to fund fortifications against France and Scotland, tangible proof that his matrimonial decisions were inseparably tied to the exigencies of statecraft. Yet traces of personal reflection lingered. Visitors to Hampton Court Palace recorded glimpses of Henry standing alone by candlelight, staring at Anne's empty apartments. He spoke once to a trusted chaplain of anger tempered by sorrow, admitting that the swift remarriage bore the necessity of the crown, not the desire of the heart. To his inner circle, he confessed a weary longing for stability, even as he pressed forward with religious reforms and alliances that would secure England's place among European powers. The policies that followed Anne's death reflected this newfound balance of force and caution. Whereas Anne's tenure had championed bold defiance of Rome, Henry's rule under Jane favoured diplomatic subtlety with the Holy See, keeping alive the hope of eventual reconciliation. Domestically, he encouraged moderate Protestant preachers, while penalising radical sects, striving to craft a religious settlement that Anne's controversial reign had only partially sketched. In the end, Henry's rapid transition from widower to betrothed to husband underscored the brutal realities of Tudor kingship. Personal grief was subordinated to dynastic necessity, and the king's private heartache became the backdrop for measures that would shape England's future. Under Jane Seymour's quiet influence, Henry found both a partner capable of stabilising the realm and a mirror for the ambitions that Anne Boleyn had unleashed, ensuring that the crown's fortunes would be forged anew in the crucible of power. Though Anne Boleyn bore no surviving sons to carry on her name, her daughter, Princess Elizabeth, emerged as the living testament to her mother's legacy. From the moment Elizabeth was born on the 7th day of September in the year 1533, her fate was entwined with courtly intrigue and royal ambition. In the aftermath of Anne's execution, the infant princess was entrusted to the care of Lady Margaret Bryan, later known as Lady Marguerite Burgundy, who had served both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn as a gentlewoman of the royal household. Under Lady Bryan's watchful eye, Elizabeth was lodged at Hatfield Palace, far from the turbulent drama of London. There, within the peaceful confines of the Hertfordshire manor, Elizabeth's early years were shaped by a steadfast governess, who, despite the political storms swirling beyond the palace gates, sought to give her charge a stable and loving environment. Lady Bryan herself, a seasoned courtier, imbued the young princess with lessons in piety and decorum, recalling the dignity her mother had displayed even on the scaffold. Elizabeth learned to read the Psalms in English and Latin, committing them to memory in long afternoons by candlelight, her small hand guided by Lady Bryan's gentle counsel. As Elizabeth grew, her education expanded to encompass French, the language of diplomacy, and Italian, prized for its literature and music. Tutors of repute were summoned to instruct her in classical authors Ovid, Cicero, and Virgil, so that she might one day govern with wisdom befitting a prince. Lessons in history were inextricably laced with the heavy example of her mother. Anne's brief reign had demonstrated both the promise and peril of wielding influence at court. Elizabeth absorbed these stories not as mere tales but as guiding parables, learning the art of measured speech and the subtlety of courtly conduct. After Jane Seymour's death on the 24th day of October in the year 1536, and during the reigns of Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr, Elizabeth's status at court fluctuated with each new queen. Yet Lady Bryan remained her constant companion, safeguarding Elizabeth's well-being amid shifting alliances and religious reforms. Under Catherine Parr's more tolerant regency, Elizabeth was permitted closer access to her father's own household, attending chapel services with the king and encountering the broader tapestry of Tudor governance. As for the sons whom Anne Boleyn had borne but never seen victims of miscarriages in the spring of 1534 and again in the autumn of 1535, their loss cast a long shadow over Tudor hopes. Contemporary chronicles record the heartbreak that attended each failed birth. Henry's yearning for a male heir, reflected in his terse entry in the privy purse expenses for the little corpse of the firstborn, and the subsequent silence following the second. These miscarried princes became anonymous martyrs of dynastic necessity, their names unrecorded save for fleeting references in letters and accounts of court physicians. No tomb cradles their memory. Instead, their brief existences are woven into the tapestry of Tudor tragedy, a reminder of the fragile line upon which royal succession rested. Ultimately, Princess Elizabeth's survival, and her flourishing into the greatest monarch of the Tudor age, stands as the most profound vindication of Anne Boleyn's maternal legacy. Though no son lived to secure Anne's hopes for a male heir, her daughter would inherit the crown and, in time, bring England into its own golden age. And so, in the child who rose to become Queen Elizabeth I, Anne's spirit found its enduring voice, shaping a destiny far beyond the shadow of her mother's tragic end. In the wake of Anne Boleyn's execution, England found itself in a delicate balance of power and faith. Politically, the Privy Council, King Henry's inner circle, grew in importance as the king sought to stabilise his realm. Thomas Cromwell, already the king's trusted chief minister, assumed even greater authority. In the months following the 19th of May in 1536, Cromwell oversaw the swift reorganisation of the council, promoting loyal administrators and sidelining those who had sympathised with Anne. He consolidated the council's functions, entrusting it with both judicial and executive duties that had previously fallen to separate bodies. By midsummer, documents show Cromwell signing proclamations that ranged from the regulation of trade to the enforcement of heresy laws, all enacted with the quiet authority of a regent in all but name. Religiously, the country teetered between further Protestant reforms and a cautious return to Catholic practices under the influence of the new Queen, Jane Seymour. Although Henry VIII remained supreme head of the Church of England, a title he had assumed on the 23rd of November in 1534, the death of Anne removed one of the most fervent advocates for radical change. Jane preferred a more conciliatory approach. She encouraged private masses and allowed clergy to wear traditional vestments, signalling a moderate Catholic sympathy. Nonetheless, under Cromwell's guidance, the dissolution of the monasteries accelerated. In late 1536 and through 1530-37, Crown Commissioners seized monastic lands and wealth, funneling revenues into the royal treasury. These measures, while financially advantageous, deepened the faith crisis in provincial communities where monasteries had served as centres of charity and learning. Socially, the waves of high-profile executions for treason, adultery, or conspiracy sent a ripple of fear through both the nobility and the common people. The deaths of Anne Boleyn and the 5 men accused alongside her on Tower Hill served as grim reminders of Henry's absolute authority. Letters from gentry families in the autumn of 1536 describe whispered rumours that any noble lady might one day find herself accused of similar crimes. Parish records note a spike in born-delivered pamphlets warning against false counsellors and wicked tongues, as villagers sought to distance themselves from any hint of dissent. In London's markets, vendors lowered their voices when discussing court affairs, fearful that overheard political opinions could lead to sudden arrest. Amid this atmosphere of apprehension, the Privy Council promulgated a series of proclamations designed to maintain public order. On the 1st of August in 1536, Henry issued a decree forbidding the dissemination of printed matter without official approval, seeking to stem seditious pamphlets. Just 2 months later, a council ordinance mandated that local magistrates take oaths to uphold the king's supremacy in all spiritual matters, an implicit warning that religious nonconformity would be treated as civil treason. Even as Jane Seymour assumed her new role as queen, her influence could not fully reverse the momentum of reform set in motion by Anne's brief tenure and Cromwell's masterful governance. The people of England remained caught between hope for spiritual continuity and the stark reality of monastic dissolution. In parish churches from Cornwall to Northumberland, congregations gathered under a mixture of Gothic austerity and Tudor pragmatism, singing hymns in English, hearing sermons from newly appointed clergy, and viewing the ornate altars that Jane had left intact. Thus, in the years after Anne Boleyn's fall, England's political and religious landscape was defined by Cromwell's expansive statecraft, Jane Seymour's moderate devotion, and a pervasive climate of fear. The dissolution continued. The Privy Council strengthened, and the populace, noble and commoner alike, learned that loyalty to the crown meant more than allegiance to a person. It required acquiescence to the sweeping changes of Tudor sovereignty. Within the quiet chill of St. Peter ad Vincula, the very air seems to hold its breath in memory of those buried beneath its flagstone floor. Directly above Anne Boleyn's resting place lies a simple stone ledger, its surface worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic, yet still bearing the faint outline of a Tudor rose, and the inscription now almost illegible that once commemorated, "Here lieth the body of Anne, Queen of England." To one side, the irregular pattern of the crypt's vaulted ceiling gives way to a handful of bricked-up niches where the remains of other fallen nobles rest in obscurity. Visitors who pause at the altar rail can catch sight of the low rectangular hatch in the chapel's stone floor, a silent testament to the hurried burial conducted mere hours after the execution on May 19, 1536. Beyond the chapel's ancient walls, A number of related treasures survive, scattered between the tower's own museum displays and the galleries of the Victoria and Albert. In a glass case at the Tower of London, a small silver chalice, its bowl engraved with a half-faded rose, has long been associated with the chapel services Anne attended on her final morning. Beside it lies a finely bound Book of Hours, its worn leather cover embossed with a curious letter B entwined in a heart-shaped frame. Scholars believe this prayer book may have passed through Anne's hands, carried by one of her ladies-in-waiting as a source of private devotion during those tense days of May 1536. Not far from these objects, a fragile parchment scroll contains the original order of funeral rites for a queen consort detailing vestments, readings, and the very psalm verses chosen for Anne's committal. Though the scroll is incomplete, the portion that remains poignantly lists the sequence of dirge, mass for the dead, and the final commendation, providing a rare window into the ceremonial world Anne once inhabited. Its vellum surface is speckled with ink blots and smudges, reminders that it was drafted in haste, under the weight of sudden royal mourning. At the Victoria and Albert Museum, a small iron-bound casket part of the V&A's Tudor metalwork collection chimes with the style of the mid-16th century. Though its provenance cannot be traced definitively to Anne herself, its clasp bears a monogram remarkably similar to those seen on surviving fragments of Boleyn jewellery. Nearby hangs a tapestry fragment woven with the arms of the Boleyn family. 6 faintly coloured shields on a field of crimson, each shield surmounted by a mitre or crown. While the tapestry's original location remains debated, its presence in the V&A underscores the enduring fascination with Anne's rise and fall. Back within the tower precincts, one can also view a reconstruction of the executioner's block, an iron-bound oaken beam reputedly modelled on the one used on Tower Green. Paired with this display is a reproduction of the executioner's two-handed sword, its polished steel echoing the forensic evidence of a single, devastating stroke. Together, these artifacts invite contemplation of the final moments of Anne's life, while the pews of St. Peter ad Vincula beckon the visitor to reflect on the passage of time. From a queen's sudden fall to the quiet dignity of her resting place, and onward to the hushed corridors of museums where her story is preserved. In these relics, stone, metal, parchment and leather, the shadow of Anne Boleyn endures. Each scratched inscription, each delicate binding, and each hammered shield fragment carries forward the memory of a woman whose life and death changed the course of English history and whose legacy continues to whisper through the silent stones of the Tower and the hushed galleries of London's great museums. In the hush that follows Anne Boleyn's tale, a clearer picture emerges of how unchecked authority can twist justice into its own reflection. King Henry VIII's swift orchestration of Anne's downfall, fabricating evidence, pressuring judges, even bribing an executioner, reveals the perils of a monarch who answers to no higher law. When power is concentrated in a single crown, the mechanisms meant to protect the innocent can be bent into instruments of political expediency. Anne's trial was not a solemn reckoning, but a carefully staged performance, orchestrated by Thomas Cromwell and sanctioned by the king himself. This tragic episode underscores the distinction between genuine law and law wielded as a tool of the powerful. True justice relies on impartial courts, open evidence, and the presumption of innocence. In Anne's case, the courts served as a theatre, and the blade at Tower Green answered not the rule of law, but the whims of those seated on the bench. Her story reminds us that when laws become pliable instruments for personal gain, they betray their very purpose: to constrain authority, protect rights, and give voice to the weak. Even today, the lesson holds weight. In modern political systems, where leaders sometimes skirt due process, disregard checks and balances, or manipulate public opinion for personal advantage, Anne's fate still casts a long shadow. Her life cautions us against hero worship of any one individual, and warns of the dangers when institutions meant to serve the common good bend to private ambition. Whether in far-off parliaments or local councils, the temptation to exploit power at the expense of justice endures. Yet from Anne Boleyn's story also springs hope. The meticulous Postmortem by Dr. Frederick Muir, centuries later, reasserted the truth beyond political spin. Archaeology and scholarship served as corrective forces, reminding posterity that even the gravest injustices can be revisited and reassessed. In that way, history itself becomes a check on tyranny, a slow but steady tribunal that honours the principle that wrongs, once recognised, demand redress. As we close her chapter, we carry forward a timeless reminder. Power without constraint corrodes the very foundations of justice, while laws honoured in both letter and spirit safeguard liberty. Anne Boleyn's voice, silenced beneath the stones of St. Peter ad Vincula, still speaks to us, urging vigilance over those who would bend justice to their will, and inspiring us to ensure that, in our time as in hers, the scales of power remain balanced by the uncompromising light of true law. Hey guys, tonight we are going to embark on a spine-chilling journey where a royal spirit still lingers within the cold, stone walls of the Tower of London. This isn't just a history story. This is a grievous, unjust sentence written in blood and lies. Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII, is a name that evokes charisma, ambition, and the most horrifying end. She wasn't just a queen who was beheaded. She was a spiritual victim, pushed into a deadly trap by the very husband she loved and trusted most. What turned a woman destined for coronation into a prisoner? Was it a curse for breaking up a royal marriage, or simply the sheer cruelty of men intent on erasing her from history? Today, we won't just talk about the French executioner's final blow. We're going to uncover the buried secrets beneath the chapel floor, where her remains were discovered centuries later. It was Dr. Frederick Moir, the royal physician, who personally conducted the exhumation and post-mortem examination, who discovered many shattering details about Anne's death and identity. He found scientific evidence that no one expected, proving an almost unbelievable fact about her little neck. But what exactly were those findings, and how shattering are they? Stay tuned in the video for the specifics. The real cause of Anne's death wasn't the sword, but the vicious lies co-conspired by the court, simply to clear the way for Jane Seymour. Do you believe in the revenge of a spirit? Prepare yourselves to listen to the story of the betrayed woman whose death changed the destiny of England forever. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm curious. Tell me where you are and what the local time is as you listen to this story. Is it raining, or are you immersed in the deep stillness of the night? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Queen Anne Boleyn was the second wife of King Henry VIII, and she is remembered most poignantly for her tragic end. She was executed and lost her head within the walls of the Tower of London. Ironically, the very place where she had once waited in anxious anticipation for her coronation as queen would become her final prison. Anne fell victim to an elaborate plot orchestrated by King Henry himself, with the backing of his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell. She was formally charged with treason, adultery, and incest charges that were later proven to be utterly false. The official cause of her death was decapitation by sword, carried out by a French executioner whose blade came down upon her neck on the morning of May 19, 1536. Yet the deeper cause was far more insidious. The web of lies woven by powerful men at court who wished to remove Anne so that the king might marry his third wife, Jane Seymour. Anne's story begins with her rise to prominence in the English court, first as a maid of honour, and then as the woman who captivated the king's heart after his marriage to Catherine of Aragon failed to produce a male heir. By the spring of 1536, she had borne him one daughter, Princess Elizabeth, but her inability to deliver a son weighed heavily on the king's mind and on the politics of succession. Behind closed doors, Henry's frustration grew, and Cromwell seized upon the moment to engineer Anne's downfall. False witnesses came forward, claiming to have seen her in compromising situations, and scandalous rumours spread like wildfire through the corridors of power. Anne's enemies at court, some of whom had long resented her influence, found in Cromwell's machinations the perfect opportunity to settle old scores. On the morning of her execution, Anne was said to have spoken with remarkable composure. According to William Kingston, the constable of the Tower of London, she summoned him so that she might receive the sacrament and affirm her innocence one last time. She jested lightly about the slenderness of her neck and expressed amusement that the executioner, though skilled, must take extra care. With her ladies-in-waiting surrounding her, she made her way to the scaffold erected on the north side of the White Tower. There, in front of hundreds of onlookers who had sneaked past locked doors or watched through narrow windows, Anne climbed the steps, her dark gown brushing the wooden planks, and addressed the crowd in a calm, measured voice. "Good Christian people," she declared, "I am come hither to die, For according to the law and by the law I am condemned to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you." After a brief prayer, she knelt, and the executioner's assistant tied a blindfold over her eyes. Anne murmured her final invocation, "O Lord, have mercy on me. O Lord, receive my soul." Then the French swordsman stepped forward, drew his two-handed sword from behind a bale of straw, and with a single, swift stroke, severed her head. The crowd gasped in horror as her body slumped, and a hush fell over the tower. Centuries later, during extensive restorations of St. Peter ad Vincula Chapel, workers uncovered a grave beneath the chapel floor, containing a decapitated female skeleton. In the 19th century, a royal physician, Dr. Frederick Maundy, conducted a post-mortem examination and identified the remains as those of a woman in the prime of life, around 25 to 30 years old, of delicate frame and slender neck details that matched contemporary descriptions of Anne. His findings confirmed what history books had recorded. Anne Boleyn's life was cut short by a conspiracy of lies, and her death by the sword was but the final act in a drama of power, deception, and ambition at the Tudor court. Anne Boleyn was undeniably one of the most controversial figures during her brief tenure as Queen of England. From the moment she stepped into the royal court, she inspired both fascination and resentment. Across the realm, many women openly despised her.